This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. To learn more or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Anti-Federalist Papers, read by M.L. Cohen, Cleveland, Ohio, May 2007. Section 26, Brutus, Letter 6. 27 December 1787. It is an important question whether the general government of the United States should be so framed as to absorb and swallow up the state governments, or whether, on the contrary, the former ought not to be confined to certain defined national objects, while the latter should retain all the powers which concern the internal police of the states. I have, in my former papers, offered a variety of arguments to prove that a simple free government could not be exercised over this whole continent, and that therefore we must either give up our liberties and submit to an arbitrary one, or frame a constitution on the plan of confederation. Further reasons might be urged to prove this point, but it seems unnecessary, because the principal advocates of the new constitution admit of the position. The question therefore between us, thus being admitted, is whether or not this system is so formed as either directly to annihilate the state governments, or that in its operation it will certainly affect it. If this is answered in the affirmative, then the system ought not to be adopted without such amendments as will avoid this consequence. If, on the contrary, it can be shown that the state governments are secured in their rights to manage the internal police of the respective states, we must confine ourselves in our inquiries to the organization of the government and the guards and provisions it contains to prevent a misuse or abuse of power. To determine this question, it is requisite that we fully investigate the nature and the extent of the powers intended to be granted by this Constitution to the rulers. In my last number, I called your attention to this subject and proved, as I think uncontrovertibly, that the powers given the legislature under the 8th section of the first article had no other limitation than the discretion of the Congress. It was shown that even if the most favorable construction was given to this paragraph, that the advocates for the new Constitution could wish, it will convey a power to lay and collect taxes, imposts, duties, and excises according to the discretion of the legislature, and to make all laws which they shall judge proper and necessary to carry this power into execution. This, I showed, was totally destroy all the power of the state governments. To confirm this, it is worthwhile to trace the operation of the government in some particular instances. The general government is to be vested with authority to levy and collect taxes, duties, and excises. The separate states have also power to impose taxes, duties, and excises, except that they cannot lay duties on exports and imports without the consent of Congress. Here, then, the two governments have concurrent jurisdiction. Both may lay impositions of this kind. But then the general government have superadded to this power authority to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying the foregoing power into execution. Suppose, then, that both governments should lay taxes, duties, and excises, and it should fall so heavy on the people that they would be unable, or be so burdensome that they would refuse to pay them both. Would it not be necessary that the general legislature should suspend the collection of the state tax? It certainly would. For, if the people could not or would not pay both, they must be discharged from the tax to the state, or the tax to the general government could not be collected. The conclusion, therefore, is inevitable, that the respective state governments will not have the power to raise 1 shilling in any way but by the permission of Congress. I presume no one will pretend that the states can exercise legislative authority or administer justice among their citizens for any length of time without being able to raise a sufficiency to pay those who administer their governments. If this be true, and if the states can raise money only by permission of the general government, it follows that the state governments will be dependent on the will of the general government for their existence. What will render this power in Congress effectual and sure in its operation is, that the government will have complete judicial and executive authority to carry all their laws into effect, which will be paramount to the judicial and executive authority of the individual states. In vain, therefore, will be all interference of the legislatures, courts, or magistrates of any of the states on the subject, for they will be subordinate to the general government and engaged by oath to support it, and will be constitutionally bound to submit to their decisions. The general legislature will be empowered to lay any tax they choose, to annex any penalties they please to the breach of their revenue laws, and to appoint as many officers as they may think proper to collect the taxes. They will have authority to farm the revenues and to vest the farmer general, with his subalterns, with plenary powers to collect them in any way which to them may appear eligible. And the courts of law, which they will be authorized to institute, will have cognizance of every case arising under the revenue laws, the conduct of all the officers employed in collecting them, and the officers of these courts will execute their judgments. There is no way, therefore, of avoiding the destruction of the state governments, whenever the Congress please to do it, unless the people rise up and, with a strong hand, resist and prevent the execution of constitutional laws. The fear of this will, it is presumed, restrain the general government for some time within proper bounds, but it will not be many years before they will have a revenue and force at their command which will place them above any apprehensions on that score. How far the power to lay and collect duties and excises may operate to dissolve the state governments and oppress the people it is impossible to say. It would assist us much in forming a just opinion on this head to consider the various objects to which this kind of taxes extend, in European nations, and the infinity of laws they have passed respecting them. Perhaps, if leisure will permit, this may be essayed in some future paper. It was observed in my last number that the power to lay and collect duties and excises would invest the Congress with authority to impose a duty and excise on every necessary and convenience of life. As the principal object of the government in laying a duty or excise will be to raise money, it is obvious that they will fix on such articles as are the most general use and consumption, because unless great quantities of the article on which the duty is laid is used, the revenue cannot be considerable. We may therefore presume that the articles which will be the object of this species of taxes will be either the real necessities of life, or if not these, such as from custom and habit are esteemed so. I will single out a few of the productions of our own country, which may, and probably will, be of the number. Cider is an article that most probably will be one of those on which an excise will be laid, because it is one which this country produces in great abundance, which is in very general use, is consumed in great quantities, and which may be said to not be a real necessary of life. An excise on this would raise a large sum of money in the United States. How would the power to lay and collect an excise on cider, and to pass all laws proper and necessary to carry it into execution, operate in its exercise? It might be necessary, in order to collect the excise on cider, to grant to one man, in each county, an exclusive right of building and keeping cider mills, and oblige him to give bonds and security for payment of the excise. Or, if this was not done, it might be necessary to license the mills which are to make this liquor, and to take from them security to account for the excise. Or, if otherwise, a great number of officers must be employed to take account of the cider made and to collect the duties on it. Porter, ale, and all kind of malt liquors are articles that would probably be subject also to an excise. It would be necessary, in order to collect such an excise, to regulate the manufacture of these, that the quantity made might be ascertained, or otherwise security could not be had for the payment of the excise. Every brewery must then be licensed, and officers appointed to take account of its product, and to secure the payment of the duty or excise before it is sold. Many other articles might be named, which would be objects of this species of taxation, but I refrain from enumerating them. It will probably be said, by those who advocate this system, that the observation already made on this head are calculated only to inflame the minds of the people with the apprehension of dangers merely imaginary; that there is not the least reason to apprehend the general legislature will exercise their power in this manner. To this I would only say, that these kind of taxes exist in Great Britain and are severely felt. The excise on cider and perry was imposed in that nation a few years ago, and it is in the memory of every one who read the history of the transaction what great tumults it occasioned. This power, exercised without limitation, will introduce itself into every corner of the city and country. It will wait upon the ladies at their toilet, and will not leave them in any of their domestic concerns. It will accompany them to the ball, the play, and the assembly. It will go with them when they visit, and will, on all occasions, sit beside them in their carriages, nor will it desert them even at church. It will enter the house of every gentleman, watch over his cellar, wait upon his cook in the kitchen, follow the servants into the parlor, preside over the table, and note down all he eats or drinks. It will attend him to his bedchamber, and watch him while he sleeps. It will take cognizance of the professional man in his office or his study. It will watch the merchant in the counting house or in his store. It will follow the mechanic to his shop and in his work, and will haunt him in his family and in his bed. It will be a constant companion of the industrious farmer in all his labor. It will be with him in his house and in the field, observe the toil of his hands and the sweat of his brow. It will penetrate into the most obscure cottage, and finally, it will light upon the head of every person in the United States. To all these different classes of people, and in all these circumstances in which it will attend them, the language in which it will address them will be give, give. A power that has such latitude, which reaches every person in the community in every conceivable circumstance, and lays hold of every species of property they possess, and which has no bounds set to it but the discretion of those who exercise it, I say, such a power must necessarily, from its very nature, swallow up all the power of the state governments. I shall add but one other observation on this head, which is this. It appears to me a solecism for two men, or bodies of men, to have unlimited power respecting the same object. It contradicts the Scripture maxim, which saith, quote, "No man can serve two masters." End quote. The one power or the other must prevail, or else they will destroy each other, and neither of them effect their purpose. It may be compared to two mechanic powers acting upon the same body in opposite directions. The consequence would be, if the powers were equal, the body would remain in a state of rest, or, if the force of the one was superior to that of the other, the stronger would prevail and overcome the resistance of the weaker. But it is said by some advocates of this system, quote, that the idea that Congress can levy taxes at pleasure is false, and the suggestion wholly unsupported, that the preamble to the Constitution is declaratory of the purposes of the Union, and the assumption of any power not necessarily to establish justice, etc., and to provide the common defense, etc., will be unconstitutional. Besides, in the very clause which gives the power of levying duties and taxes, the purposes to which the money shall be appropriated are specified, that is, to pay the debts, and provide for the common defense and general welfare. End quote. I would ask those who reason thus to define what ideas are included under the terms to provide for the common defense and general welfare. Are these terms definite, and will they be understood in the same manner and to apply to the same cases by everyone? No one will pretend they will. It will then be a matter of opinion, what tends to the general welfare, and the Congress will be the only judges in the matter. To provide for the general welfare, an abstract proposition which mankind differ in explanation of as much as they do on any political or moral proposition that can be proposed. The most opposite measures may be pursued by different parties, and both may profess that they have in view the general welfare, and both sides may be honest in their professions, or both may have sinister views. Those who advocate this new Constitution declare they are influenced by a regard to the general welfare. Those who oppose it declare they are moved by the same principle, and I have no doubt but a number on both sides are honest in their professions. And yet nothing is more certain than this, that to adopt this Constitution and not to adopt it cannot both of them be promotive of the general welfare. It is absurd to say that the power of Congress is limited by these general expressions, quote, "to provide for the common safety and general welfare," end quote, as it would be to say that it would be limited had the Constitution said they should have the power to lay taxes, etc., at will and pleasure. Were this authority given, it might be said that under it the legislature could not do injustice or pursue any measures but such as were calculated to promote the public good and happiness. For every man, rulers as well as others, are bound by the immutable laws of God and reason, always to will what is right. It is certainly right and fit that the governors of every people should provide for the common defense and general welfare. Every government, therefore, in the world, even the greatest despot, is limited in the exercise of his power. But however just this reasoning may be, it would be found in practice a most pitiful restriction. The government would always say their measures were designed and calculated to promote the public good, and there being no judge between them and the people, the rulers themselves must, and would always, judge for themselves. There are others of the favorers of this system who admit that the power of the Congress under it with respect to revenue will exist without limitation, and contend that so it ought to be. It is said, "The power to raise armies, to build and equip fleets, and to provide for their support ought to exist without limitation, because it is impossible to foresee or to define the extent and variety of national exigencies, or the corresponding extent and variety of the means which may be necessary to satisfy them." This, it is said, "is one of those truths which, to correct an unprejudiced mind, carries its own evidence along with it. It rests upon axioms as simple as they are universal. The means ought to be proportioned to the end. The person from whose agency the attainment of any end is expected ought to possess the means by which it is to be attained." This same writer insinuates that the opponents to the plan promulgated by the convention manifests a want of candor in objecting to the extent of the powers proposed to be vested in this government, because he asserts, with an air of confidence, that the powers ought to be unlimited as to the object to which they extend, and that this position, if not self-evident, is at least clearly demonstrated by the foregoing mode of reasoning. But with the submission to this author's better judgment, I humbly conceive his reasoning will appear upon examination more specious than solid. The means, say the gentlemen, ought to be proportional to the end. Admit the proposition to be true, it is then necessary to inquire what is the end of the government of the United States, in order to draw any just conclusions from it. Is this end simply to preserve the general government, and to provide for the common defense and general welfare of the Union only? Certainly not. For beside this, the State governments are to be supported, and provision made for the managing such of their internal concerns as are allotted to them. It is admitted, "that the circumstances of our country are such as to demand a compound instead of a simple, a confederate instead of a sole government," that the objects of each ought to be pointed out, and that each ought to possess ample authority to execute the powers committed to them. The government, then, being complex in its nature, the end it has in view is so also, and it is as necessary that the State governments should possess the means to attain the ends expected from them as for the general government. Neither the general government nor the State governments ought to be vested with all the powers proper to be exercised for promoting the ends of government. The powers are divided between them. Certain ends are to be attained by the one, and other certain ends by the other, and these, taken together, include all the ends of good government. This being the case, the conclusion follows that each should be furnished with the means to attain the ends to which they are designed. To apply this reasoning to the case of revenue, the general government is charged with the care of providing for the payment of the debts of the United States, supporting the general government, and providing for the defense of the Union. To obtain these ends, they should be furnished with means. But does it thence follow that they should command all the revenues of the United States? Most certainly it does not. For if so, it will follow that no means will be left to attain other ends as necessary to the happiness of the country as those committed to their care. The individual states have debts to discharge, their legislatures and executive are to be supported, and provision is to be made for the administration of justice in the respective states. For these objects the general government has no authority to provide, nor is it proper it should. It is clear, then, that the states should have the command of such revenues as to answer the ends they have to obtain. To say, "that the circumstances that endanger the safety of nations are infinite," and from hence to infer that all the sources of revenue in the states should be yielded to the general government, is not conclusive reasoning, for the Congress are authorized only to control in general concerns, and not regulate local and internal ones, and these are as essentially requisite to be provided as for those. The peace and happiness of a community is as intimately connected with the prudent direction of their domestic affairs and the due administration of justice among themselves as with a competent provision for their defense against foreign invaders, and indeed more so. Upon the whole, I conceive that there cannot be a clearer position than this, that the state governments ought to have an uncontrollable power to raise a revenue adequate to the exigencies of their governments, and, I presume, no such power is left them by this Constitution. Brutus. End of Anti-Federalist Papers, Section 26, Brutus, Letter 6. Papers, Section 27, Brutus, Letter 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by M.L. Cohen, Cleveland, Ohio, May 2007. 3rd January 1788. The result of our reasoning in the two preceding numbers is this, that in a confederated government where the powers are divided between the general and the state government, it is essential to its existence that the revenues of the country without which no government can exist should be divided between them, and so apportioned each as to answer their respective exigencies, as far as human wisdom can effect such a division and apportionment. It has been shown that no such allotment is made in this Constitution, but that every source of revenue is under control of the Congress. It therefore follows that if this system is intended to be a complex and not simple, a confederate and not an entire consolidated government, it contains in it the sure seeds of its own dissolution. One of two things must happen. Either the new Constitution will become a mere nudum pactum, and all authority of the rulers under it will be cried down as has happened to the present Confederation, or the authority of the individual states will be totally supplanted, and they will retain the mere form without any of the powers of government. To one or the other of these issues, I think, this new government, if it is adopted, will advance with great celerity. It is said, I know, that such a separation of the sources of revenue cannot be made without endangering the public safety. Unless, says a writer, it can be shown that the circumstances which may affect the public safety are reducible within certain determinate limits. Unless the contrary of this position can be fairly and rationally disputed, it must be admitted as a necessary consequence that there can be no limitation of that authority which is to provide for the defense and protection of the community, etc. The pretended demonstration of this writer will instantly vanish when it is considered that the protection and defense of the community is not intended to be entrusted solely into the hands of the general government, and by his own confession it ought not to be. It is true this system commits to the general government the protection and defense of the community against foreign force and invasion, against piracies and felonies on the high seas, and against insurrections among ourselves. They are also authorized to provide for the administration of justice in certain matters of a general concern, and some that I think are not so. But it ought to be left to the state government to provide for the protection and defense of the citizen against the hand of private violence, and the wrongs done or attempted by individuals to each other. Protection and defense against the murderer, the robber, the thief, the cheat, and the unjust person is to be derived from the respective state governments. The just way of reasoning, therefore, on this subject is this, that the general government is to provide for the protection and defense of the community against foreign attacks, etc. They therefore ought to have authority sufficient to effect this, so far as is consistent with providing for our internal protection and defense. The state governments are entrusted with the care of administering justice among citizens and the management of other internal concerns. They ought therefore to retain power adequate to the end. The preservation of internal peace and good order, and the due administration of law and justice, ought to be the first care of every government. The happiness of a people depends infinitely more on this than it does upon all that glory and respect which nature acquires by the most brilliant martial achievements. And I believe history will furnish but few examples of nations who have duly attended to these, who have been subdued by foreign invaders. If a proper respect and submission to the laws prevailed over all orders of men in our country, and if a spirit of public and private justice, economy, and industry influenced the people, we need not be under any apprehensions but what they would be ready to repel any invasion that might be made on the country. And more than this I would not wish from them. A defensive war is the only one I think justifiable. I do not make these observations to prove that a government ought not to be authorized to provide for the protection and defense of a country against external enemies, but to show that this is not the most important, much less the only object of their care. The European governments are almost all of them framed and administered with a view to arms and war, as that in which the chief glory consists. They mistake the end of government. It was designed to save men's lives, not destroy them. We ought to furnish the world with an example of a great people, who in their civil institutions hold chiefly in view the attainment of virtue and happiness among ourselves. Let the monarchs in Europe share among them the glory of depopulating countries and of butchering thousands of their innocent citizens to revenge private quarrels, or to punish an insult offered to a wife, a mistress, or a favorite. I envy them not the honor, and I pray heaven this country may never be ambitious of it. The Tsar Peter the Great acquired great glory by his arms, but all this was nothing compared with the glory which he obtained by civilizing his rude and barbarous subjects, diffusing among them knowledge, and establishing and cultivating the arts of life. By the former he desolated countries and drenched the earth with human blood. By the latter he softened the ferocious nature of his people, and pointed them to the means of human happiness. The most important end of government, then, is the proper direction of its internal policy and economy. This is the province of the state governments, and it is evident, and is indeed admitted, that these ought to be under their control. Is it not then preposterous, and in the highest degree absurd, when the state governments are vested with power so essential to the peace and good order of society, to take from them the means of their own preservation? The idea that the powers of Congress in respect to revenue ought to be unlimited, "because the circumstances which may affect the public safety are not reducible to certain determinate limits," is novel as it relates to the government of the United States. The inconveniencies which result from the feebleness of the present confederation was discussed and felt soon after its adoption. It was soon discovered that a power to require money without either the authority or means to enforce a collection of it could not be relied upon either to provide for the common defense, the discharge of national debt, or for support of government. Congress, therefore, so early as February 1781, recommended to the States to invest them with the power to levy an impost of 5% ad valorem on all imported goods as a fund to be appropriated to discharge the debts already contracted, or which should hereafter be contracted for the support of the war, to be continued until the debt should be fully and finally discharged. There is not the most distant idea held out in this act that an unlimited power to collect taxes, duties, and excises was necessary to be vested within the United States, and yet this was a time of the most pressing danger and distress. The idea then was, that if a certain definite funds were assigned to the Union, which were certain in their natures, productive, and easy of collection, it would enable them to answer their engagements and provide for their defense, and the impost of 5% was fixed upon for that purpose. This same subject was revived in the winter and spring of 1783, and after long consideration of the subject, and many schemes were proposed. The result was a recommendation of the revenue system of April, 1783. This system does not suggest an idea that it was necessary to grant the United States unlimited authority in matters of revenue. A variety of amendments were proposed to this system, some of which are upon the journals of Congress, but it does not appear that any of them propose to invest the general government with discretionary power to raise money. On the contrary, all of them limit them to certain definite objects and fix the bounds over which they could not pass. This recommendation was passed at the conclusion of the war, and was founded on an estimate of the whole national debt. It was computed that $1.5 million of dollars, in addition to the impost, was a sufficient sum to pay the annual interest of the debt, and gradually to abolish the principal. Events have proved that their estimate was sufficiently liberal, as the domestic debt appears upon its being adjusted to be less than it was computed, and since this period a considerable portion of the principal of the domestic debt has been discharged by the sale of the Western land. It has been constantly urged by Congress and by individuals ever since, until lately, that had this revenue been appropriated by the States, as it was recommended, it would have been adequate to every exigency of the Union. Now, indeed, it is insisted that all the treasures of this country are to be under the control of that body whom we are to appoint to provide for our protection and defense against foreign enemies. The debts of the several States and the supportive governments of them are to trust to fortune and accident. If the Union should not have occasion for all the money they can raise, they will leave a portion for the State, but this may be a matter of mere grace and favor. Doctrines like these would not have been listened to by any State in the Union, at a time when we were pressed on every side by a powerful enemy, and were called upon to make greater exertions than we have any reason to expect we shall ever be again. The ability and character of the convention, who framed the perfect Constitution, is sounded forth and reiterated by every declaimer and writer in its favor, as a powerful argument to induce its adoption. But are not the patriots who guided our counsels in the perilous times of the war entitled to equal respect? How has it happened that none of these perceived the truth, which it is pretended is capable of such clear demonstration, that the power to raise the revenue should be deposited in the general government without limitation? Were the men so dull of apprehension, so incapable of reasoning, as not to be able to draw the inference? The truth is, no such necessity exists. It is a thing practicable, and by no means so different as pretended, to limit the powers of the general government in respect to revenue, while yet they may retain reasonable means to provide for the common defense. It is admitted that human wisdom cannot foresee all the variety of circumstances that may arise to endanger the safety of nations. And it may with equal truth be added that the power of a nation exerted with its utmost vigor may not be equal to repel a force with which it may be assailed, much less may it be able with its ordinary resources and power to oppose an extraordinary and unexpected attack. But yet every nation may form a rational judgment what force will be competent to protect and defend it against an enemy which it is probable it may have to contend. In extraordinary attacks, every country must rely upon the spirit and special exertion of its inhabitants, and these extraordinary efforts will always very much depend upon the happiness and good order of the people experienced from wise and prudent administration of their internal government. The states are as capable of making a just estimate on this head as perhaps any nation in the world. We have no powerful nation in our neighborhood. If we are to go to war, it must either be with the aboriginal natives or with European nations. The first are so unequal to a contest with this whole continent that they are rather to be dreaded for the depredations they may make on our frontiers than for any impression they will ever be able to make on the body of the country. Some of the European nations, it is true, have provinces bordering upon us, but from these, unsupported by the European forces, we have nothing to apprehend. If any of them should attack us, they will have to transport their armies across the Atlantic at immense expense, while we should defend ourselves in our own country, which abounds with every necessity of life. For defense against any assault, which there is any probability will be made upon us, we may easily form an estimate. I may be asked to point out the sources from which the general government could derive a sufficient revenue to answer the demands of the Union. Many might be suggested, and for my part I am not disposed to be tenacious of my own opinion on the subject. If the object be defined with precision, and will operate to make the burden fall anything nearly equal on the different parts of the Union, I shall be satisfied. There is one source of revenue which is agreed the general government ought to have the sole control of. This is an impost upon all goods imported from foreign countries. This would of itself be very productive, and would be collected with ease and certainty. It will be a fund, too, constantly increasing, for our commerce will grow with the productions of the country, and these, together with our consumption of foreign goods, will increase with our population. It is said that the impost will not produce a sufficient sum to satisfy the demands of the general government. Perhaps it would not. Let some other, then, equally well defined, be assigned them. This is practicable as certain, because such particular objects were proposed by some members of Congress when the revenue system of April 1783 was agitated in that body. It was then moved that a tax at a rate of 19ths of a dollar on surveyed land and a house tax of half a dollar on a house should be granted to the United States. I do not mention this because I approve of raising a revenue in this mode. I believe such a tax would be difficult in its collection and inconvenient in its operation. But it shows that it has heretofore been the sense of some of those who now contend that the general government should have unlimited authority in matters of revenue, that their authority should be definite and limited on that head. My own opinion is that the objects from which the general government should have authority to raise revenue should be of such a nature that the tax should be raised by simple laws, with few officers, with certainty and expedition, and with the least interference with the internal police of the states. Of this nature is an impost on imported goods, and it appears to me that a duty on exports would also be of this nature, and therefore, for I can discover, this would be the best source of revenue to grant the general government. I know neither the Congress nor the state legislatures will have authority under the new Constitution to raise a revenue in this way, but I cannot perceive the reason for the restriction. It appears to me evident that a tax on articles exported would be as nearly equal to any that we can expect to lay, and it certainly would be collected with more ease and less expense than any direct tax. I do not, however, contend for this mode. it may be liable to well-founded objections that have not occurred to me. But this I do contend for, that some mode is practicable, and that limits must be marked between the general government and the states on this head, or if they be not, either the Congress, in the exercising of this power, will deprive the state legislatures of the means of their existence, or the states, by resisting the constitutional authority of the general government, will render it nugatory. Brutus. End Anti-Federalist Papers, section 27. Anti-Federalist Papers, section 28. Brutus, letter 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by M.L. Cohen, Cleveland, Ohio, May 2007. 10 January 1788. The next power is vested by this Constitution in the general government, which we shall consider, are those which authorize them to, quote, borrow money on the credit of the United States and to raise and support armies, end quote. I take these two together and connect them with the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, because their extent and the danger that will arise from the exercise of these powers cannot be fully understood unless they are viewed in relation to each other. The power to borrow money is general and unlimited, and the clause so often before referred to authorizes the passing any laws proper and necessary to carry this into execution. Under this authority, the Congress may mortgage any or all of the revenues of the Union as a fund to loan money upon, and it is probably in this way that they may borrow foreign nations a principal sum, the interest of which will be equal to the annual revenues of the country. By this means, they may create a national debt so large as to exceed the ability of the country ever to sink. I can scarcely contemplate a greater calamity than could befall this country than to be loaded with a debt exceeding their ability ever to discharge. If this be a just remark, it is unwise and improvident to vest in the general government a power to borrow at discretion, without any limitation or restriction. It may possibly happen that the safety and welfare of the country may require that money be borrowed, and it is proper when such a necessity arises that the power should be exercised by the general government. But it certainly ought never to be exercised but on the most urgent occasions, and then we should not borrow of foreigners if we could possibly avoid it. The Constitution should therefore have so restricted the exercise of this power as to have rendered it very difficult for the government to practice it. The present Confederation requires the assent of 9 states to exercise this, and a number of the other important powers of the Confederacy, and it would certainly have been a wise provision in this Constitution to have made it necessary that 2/3 of the members should assent to borrowing money, when the necessity was indispensable. This assent would always be given, and in no other cause ought it be. The power to raise armies is indefinite and unlimited, and authorizes the raising forces as well in peace as in war. Whether the clause which empowers the Congress to pass all laws which are proper and necessary to carry this into execution will not authorize them to impress men for the army is a question well worthy of consideration. If the general legislature deem it for the general welfare to raise a body of troops, and they cannot be procured by voluntary enlistments, it seems evident that it will be proper and necessary to effect it, that men be impressed from the militia to make up the deficiency. These powers taken in connection amount to this, that the general government have unlimited authority and control over all the wealth and all the force of the Union. The advocates for this scheme would favor the world with a new discovery if they would show what kind of freedom or independency is left to the state governments when they cannot command any part of the property or of the force of the country but at the will of Congress. It seems to me as absurd as it would be to say that I was free and independent when I had conveyed all my property to another, and was tenant to will to him, and had beside given an indenture of myself to serve him during my life. The power to keep up standing armies in time of peace has been justly objected to this system as dangerous and improvident. The advocates who have wrote in its favor have some of them ridiculed the objection, as though it originated in the distempered brain of its opponents, and others have taken pains to show that it is a power that was proper to be granted to the rulers in this Constitution. That you may be enabled to form a just opinion on this subject, I shall first make some remarks tending to prove that this power ought to be restricted, and then animadvert on the arguments which have been adduced to justify it. I take it for granted, as an axiom in politic, that the people should never authorize their rulers to do anything which if done would operate to their injury. It seems equally clear that in the case where a power, if given and exercised, will generally produce evil to the community and seldom good, and which experience has proved has most frequently been exercised to the great injury and very often to the total destruction of the government, in such a case, I say, this power, if given at all, should be, if possible, so restricted as to prevent the ill effect of its operation. Let us then inquire whether standing armies in time of peace would be ever beneficial to our country, or if in some extraordinary cases they might be necessary; whether it is not true that they have generally proved a scourge to a country, and destructive of their liberty. I shall not take up much of your time in proving a point, in which the friends of liberty in all countries have so universally agreed. The following extract from Mr. Putney's speech delivered in the House of Commons of Great Britain on a motion for reducing the army is so full to the point, and so much better than anything I can say, that I shall be excused for inserting it. He says, quote, "I have always been and always shall be against a standing army of any kind. To me it is a terrible thing, whether under that of a parliamentary or any other designation. A standing army is still a standing army, but whatever name it is called. They are a body of men distinct from the body of the people. They are governed by different laws, and blind obedience, and an entire submission to the orders of their commanding officer, is their only principles. The nations around us, sir, are already enslaved by those very means. By means of their standing armies they have every one lost their liberties. It is indeed impossible that the liberties of the people in any country can be preserved where a numerous standing army is kept up. Shall we then take our measures from the example of our neighbor? No, sir; on the contrary, from their misfortunes ought we to learn to avoid those rocks upon which they have split. It signifies nothing to tell me that our army is commanded by such gentlemen as cannot be supposed to join in any measures for enslaving their country. It may be so. I have a very good opinion of many gentlemen now in the army. I believe they would not join in any such measures, but their lives are uncertain, nor can we be sure how long they will be kept in command. They may all be dismissed in a moment, and proper tools of power put in their room. Besides, sir, we know the passions of men. We know how dangerous it is to trust the best of men with too much power. Where was a braver army than that under Julius Caesar? Where was there ever an army that had served their country more faithfully? That army was commanded generally by the best citizens of Rome, by men of great fortune and figure in their country, yet that army enslaved their country. The affections of the soldiers toward their country, the honor and integrity of their under officers are not to be depended upon. By the military law the administration of justice is so quick, and the punishment so severe, that neither the officer nor soldier dare dispute the orders of his supreme commander. He must not consult his own inclination. If an officer were commanded to pull his own father out of this house, he must do it. He dares not disobey. Immediate death would be the sure consequence of the least grumbling. And if an officer were sent into the court of request accompanied by a body of musketeers with screwed bayonets, and with orders to tell us what we ought to do and how we were to vote, I know what would be the duty of this house. I know it would be our duty to order the officer to be hanged at the door of the lobby. But I doubt, sir, I doubt much if such a spirit could be found in the House, or in any House of Commons that will ever be in England. Sir, I talk not of imaginary things. I talk of what has happened to an English House of Commons, from an English army, not only from an English army, but an army that was raised by that very House of Commons, an army that was paid by them, and an army that was commanded by generals appointed by them. Therefore do not let us vainly imagine that an army, raised and maintained by authority of Parliament, will always be so submissive to them. If an army be so numerous as to have it in their power to overawe the Parliament, they will be submissive as long as the Parliament does nothing to disoblige their favorite general. But when that case happens, I am afraid that in place of the Parliament's dismissing the army will dismiss the Parliament." If this great man's reasoning be just, it follows that keeping up a standing army would be in the highest degree dangerous to the liberty and happiness of the community. And if so, the general government ought not to have authority to do it, for no government should be empowered to do that which, if done, would tend to destroy public liberty. Brutus. End Anti-Federalist Papers, section 28. Anti-Federalist Papers, Section 29, Brutus, Letter 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by M.L. Cohen, Cleveland, Ohio, May 2007. 17 January 1788. The design of civil government is to protect the rights and promote the happiness of the people. For this end, rulers are invested with powers. But we cannot from hence justly infer that these powers should be unlimited. There are certain rights which mankind possess, over which government ought not to have any control, because it is not necessary they should in order to attain the end of its institution. There are certain things which rulers should be absolutely prohibited from doing, because, if they should do them, they would work an injury, not a benefit, to the people. Upon the same principles of reasoning, if the exercise of a power is found generally or in most cases to operate to the injury of the community, the legislature should be restricted in the exercise of that power, so as to guard as much as possible against the danger. These principles seem to be evident dictates of common sense, and what ought to give sanction to them in the minds of every American, they are the great principles of the late Revolution, and those which govern the framers of our state constitutions. Hence we find that all the state constitutions contain either former bills of rights, which set the boundaries or powers of the legislature, or have restrictions for the same purpose in the body of the constitutions. Some of our new political doctors, indeed, reject the idea of the necessity or propriety of such restrictions in any elective government, but especially in the general one. But it is evident that the framers of this new system were of a contrary opinion, because they have prohibited to general government the exercise of some powers, and restricted them in that of others. I shall adduce two instances, which will serve to illustrate my meaning, as well as to confirm the truth of the preceding remark. In the 9th section it is declared, quote, "No bill of attainder shall be passed." End quote. This clause takes from the legislature all power to declare a particular person guilty of a crime by law. It is proper the legislature should be deprived of the exercise of this power, because it seldom is exercised to the benefit of the community, but generally to its injury. In the same section it is provided that, quote, "The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended, unless when in cases of rebellion and invasion the public safety may require it." End quote. This clause limits the power of the legislature to deprive a citizen of the right of habeas corpus to particular cases, that is, those of rebellion and invasion. The reason is plain, because in no other cases can this power be exercised for the general good. Let us apply these remarks to the case of standing armies in times of peace. If they generally prove the destruction of the happiness and liberty of the people, the legislator ought not to have power to keep them up, or if they had, this power should be so restricted as to secure the people against the danger arising from the exercise of it. That standing armies are dangerous to the liberties of a people was proved in my last number. If it was necessary, the truth of the position might be confirmed by history of almost every nation of the world. A cloud of the most illustrious patriots of every age and country where freedom has been enjoyed might be adduced as witnesses in support of the sentiment. But I presume it would be useless to enter into a labored agreement to prove to the people of America a position which has so long and so generally been received by them as a kind of axiom. Some of the advocates for this new system controvert this sentiment, as they do almost every other that has been maintained by the best writers on free government. Others, though they will not expressly deny that standing armies in time of peace are dangerous, yet join with these in maintaining that it is proper the general government should be vested with the power to do it. I shall now proceed to examine the arguments they adduce in support of their opinions. A writer, in favor of this system, treats this objection as a ridiculous one. He supposes it would be as proper to provide against the introduction of Turkish Janissaries or against making the Alcoran a rule of faith. From the positive and dogmatic manner in which this author delivers his opinions and answers objections made to his sentiments, one would conclude that he was some pedantic pedagogue who had been accustomed to deliver his dogmas to pupils, who always placed implicit faith in what he delivered. But why is this provision so ridiculous? Because, says this author, it is unnecessary. But why is it unnecessary? Quote, Because the principles and habits as well as the powers of the American are directly opposed to standing armies, and there is as little necessity to guard against them by a positive constitutions as to prohibit the establishment of the Mahometan religion." It is admitted, then, that a standing army in time of peace is an evil. I ask, then, why should this government be authorized to do evil? If the principles and habits of the people of this country are opposed to standing armies in time of peace, if they do not contribute to the public good, but would endanger the public liberty and happiness, why should the government be vested with the power? No reason can be given why rulers should be authorized to do what, if done, would oppose the principles and habits of the people and endanger the public safety, but there is every reason in the world that they should be prohibited from the exercise of such a power. But this author supposes that no danger is to be apprehended from the exercise of this power because, if armies are kept up, it will be by the people themselves, and therefore to provide against it would be as absurd as for a man to "pass a law in his family that no troops be quartered in his family by his consent." This reasoning supposes that the general government is to be exercised by the people of America themselves. But such an idea is groundless and absurd. There is surely a distinction between the people and their rulers, even when the latter are representatives of the former. They certainly are not identically the same, and it cannot be disputed, but it may and often does happen, that they do not possess the same sentiments or pursue the same interests. I think I have shown that as this government is constituted, there is little reason to expect that the interests of the people and their rulers will be the same. Besides, if the habits and sentiments of the people of America are to be relied upon as the sole security against encroachment of their rulers, all restrictions and constitutions are unnecessary. Nothing more is requisite than to declare who shall be authorized to exercise the powers of government, and about this we need not be very careful, for the habits and principles of the people will oppose every abuse of power. This I suppose to be the sentiments of this author, as it seems to be of many of the advocates of this new system. An opinion like this is as directly opposed to the principles and habits of the people of America as it is to the sentiments of every writer of reputation on the science of government, and repugnant to the principles of reason and common sense. The idea that there is no danger of establishment of a standing army under the new Constitution is without foundation. It is a well-known fact that a number of those who had an agency in producing this system, and many of those who it is probable will have a principal share in the administration of the government under it, if it is adopted, are avowedly in favor of standing armies. It is a language common among them, "that no people can be kept in order unless the government have an army to awe them into obedience. It is necessary to support the dignity of government to have a military establishment." And there will not be wanting a variety of plausible reason to justify the raising one, drawn from the danger we are in from the Indians on our frontiers, or from the European provinces in our neighborhood. If to this we add that an army will afford a decent support and agreeable employment to the young men of many families who are too indolent to follow the occupations that will require care and industry, and too poor to live without doing any business, we can have little reason to doubt but that we shall have a large standing army as soon as this government can find money to pay them, and perhaps sooner. A writer, who is the boast of the advocates of the new Constitution, has taken great pains to show that this power was proper and necessary to be vested in the general government. He sets out with calling in question the candor and integrity of those who advance the objection, and with insinuating that it is their intention to mislead the people by alarming their passions rather than convince them by arguments addressed to their understandings. The man who reproves another for a fault should be careful that he himself be not guilty of it. How far this writer has manifested a spirit of candor, and has pursued fair reasoning on this subject, the impartial public will judge, when his arguments pass before them in review. He first attempts to show that this objection is futile and disingenuous, because the power to keep up standing armies in time of peace is vested under the present government in the legislature of every state of the Union except 2. Now this is so far from being true that it is expressly declared by the present Articles of Confederation that no body of forces "shall be kept up by any state in time of peace except such number only as in the judgment of the United States and Congress assembled shall be deemed requisite to garrison the forts necessary for the defense of such state." Now, was it candid and ingenuous to endeavor to persuade the public that the general government had no other power than your own legislature have on this head, when the truth is your legislature have no authority to raise and keep up any forces? He next tells us that the power given by this Constitution on this head is similar to that which Congress possess under the present Confederation. As little ingenuity is manifested in this representation as in that of the former. I shall not undertake to inquire whether or not Congress are vested with the power to keep up a standing army in time of peace. It has been a subject, warmly debated in Congress more than once since the peace, and one of the most respectable states in the Union were so fully convinced that they had no such power that they expressly instructed their delegates to enter a solemn protest against it on the journals of Congress, should they attempt to exercise it. But should it be admitted that they have the power, there is such a striking dissimilarity between the restrictions under which the present Congress can exercise it and that of the proposed government, that the comparison will serve rather to show the impropriety of vesting the proposed government with the power than of justifying it. It is acknowledged by this writer that the powers of Congress under the present Confederation amount to little more than that of recommending. If they determine to raise troops, they are obliged to effect it through the authority of the state legislatures. This will, in the first instance, be a most powerful restraint upon them against ordering troops to be raised. But if they should vote an army contrary to the opinion and wishes of the people, the legislatures of the respective states would not raise them. Besides, the present Congress hold their places at the will and pleasure of the legislatures of the states who send them, and no troops can be raised but by the assent of 9 states out of the 13. Compare the power proposed to be lodged in the legislature on this head under this Constitution with that vested in the present Congress, and every person of the least discernment, whose understanding is not totally blinded by prejudice, will perceive that they bear no analogy to each other. Under the present Confederation, the representatives of 9 states out of 13 must assent to the raising of troops, or they cannot be levied. Under the proposed Constitution, a less number than the representatives of 2 states in the House of Representatives and the representatives of 3 states and a half in the Senate, with the assent of the President, may raise any number of troops they please. The present Congress are restrained from an undue exercise of this power from this consideration. They know that the state legislatures, through whose authority it must be carried into effect, would not comply with the requisition for the purpose, if it was evidently opposed to the public good. The proposed Constitution authorizes the legislature to carry their determinations into execution without the intervention of any other body between them and the people. The Congress under the present form are amenable to, and removable by, the legislatures of the respective states, and are chosen for 1 year only. The proposed Constitution does not make the members of the legislature accountable to or removable by the state legislatures at all, and they are chosen, this one house for 6 and the other for 2 years, and cannot be removed until their time of service is expired, let them conduct themselves ever so badly. The public will judge, from the above comparison, how just a claim this writer has to that candor he affects to possess. In the meantime, to convince him and the advocates for this system that I possess some share of candor, I pledge myself to give up all opposition to it on the head of standing armies, if the power to raise them be restricted as it is in the present Confederation, and I believe I may safely answer, not only for myself, but for all who make the objection, that they will be satisfied with less. Brutus. End Anti-Federalist Papers, section 29. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Anti-Federalist Papers. The Anti-Federalist Papers, Section 30, Brutus, Letter 10. Read by M.L. Cohen, Cleveland, Ohio, May 2007. 24 January 1788. To the People of the State of New York. The liberties of a people are in danger from a large standing army, not only because the rulers may employ them for the purposes of supporting themselves in any usurpations of power which they may see proper to exercise, but there is great hazard that an army will subvert the forms of the government under whose authority they are raised, and establish one according to the pleasure of their leader. We are informed, in the faithful pages of history, of such events frequently happening. 2 instances have been mentioned in a former paper. They are so remarkable that they are worthy of the most careful attention of every lover of freedom. They are taken from the history of the 2 most powerful nations that have ever existed in the world, and who are the most renowned for the freedom they enjoyed, and the excellencies of their constitutions. I mean Rome and Britain. In the first, the liberties of the Commonwealth was destroyed, and the constitution overturned by an army led by Julius Caesar, who was appointed to the command by the constitutional authority of that Commonwealth. He changed it from a free republic, whose fame is sounded and is still celebrated by all the world, into that of the most absolute despotism. A standing army effected this change, and a standing army supported it through a succession of ages, which are marked in the annals of history with the most horrid cruelties, bloodshed, and carnage, the most devilish, beastly, and unnatural vices that ever punished or disgraced human nature. The same army that in Britain vindicated the liberties of that people from the encroachments and despotism of a tyrant king assisted Cromwell, their general, in wresting from the people that liberty they had so dearly earned. You may be told these instances will not apply to our case, but those who would persuade you to believe this either mean to deceive you or have not themselves considered the subject. I firmly believe no country in the world had ever a more patriotic army than the one which so ably served this country in the late war. But had the general who commanded them been possessed of the spirit of a Julius Caesar or a Cromwell, the liberties of this country had in all probability terminated with the war, or had they been maintained, might have cost more blood and treasure than was expended in the conflict with Great Britain. When an anonymous writer addressed the officers of the army at the close of the war, advising them not to part with their arms until justice was done them, the effect it had is well known. It affected them like an electric shock. He wrote like Caesar, and had the commander-in-chief and a few more officers of rank countenanced the measure, the desperate resolution had been taken to refuse to disband. What the consequences of such a determination would have been, Heaven only knows. The army were in the full vigor of health and spirits, in the habit of discipline, and possessed of all our military stores and apparatus. They would have acquired great accessions of strength from the country. Those who were disgusted at our republican forms of government, for such then there were of high rank among us, would have lent them all their aid. We should, in all probability, have seen a constitution and laws dictated us at the head of an army and at the point of a bayonet, and the liberties for which we had so severely struggled snatched from us in a moment. It remains a secret yet to be revealed whether this measure was not suggested, or at least countenanced, by some who have had great influence in producing the present system. Fortunately indeed for this country, it had at the head of an army a patriot as well as a general, and many of our principal officers had not abandoned the characters of citizens by assuming that of soldiers, and therefore the scheme proved abortive. But are we to expect that this will always be the case? Are we so much better than the people of other ages and of other countries, that the same allurements of power and greatness which led them astray from their duty will have no influence upon men in our country? Such an idea is wild and extravagant. Had we indulged such a delusion, enough has appeared in a little time past to convince the most credulous that the passion for pomp, power, and greatness works as powerfully in the hearts of many of our better sort as it ever did in any country under heaven. Were the same opportunity again to offer, we should very probably be grossly disappointed if we made dependence that all who then rejected the overture would do it again. From these remarks it appears that the evil to be feared from a large standing army in time of peace does not arise solely from the apprehension that the rulers may employ them for the purposes of promoting their own ambitious views, but that equal and perhaps greater danger is to be apprehended from their overturning the constitutional powers of the government, and assuming the powers to dictate any form they please. The advocates for power in support of this right in the proposed government urged that a restraint upon the discretion of the legislatures in respect to military establishments in time of peace would be improper to be imposed, because, they say, it will be necessary to maintain small garrisons on the frontiers to guard against the depredation of the Indians and to be prepared to repel any encroachments or invasions that may be made by Spain or Britain. The amount of this argument, stripped of the abundant verbiages with which the author has dressed it, is this: it will probably be necessary to keep up a small body of troops to garrison a few posts, which it will be necessary to maintain in order to guard against the sudden encroachments of the Indians or of the Spaniards and British. And therefore the general government ought to be invested with power to raise and keep up a standing army in time of peace, without restraint, at their discretion. I confess, I cannot perceive that the conclusion follows from the premises. Logicians say, it is not good reasoning to infer a general conclusion from particular premises. Though I am not much of a logician, it seems to me that this argument is very like that species of reasoning. When the patriots in the Parliament in Great Britain contended with such force of argument and all the powers of eloquence against keeping up standing armies in time of peace, it is obvious they never entertained an idea that small garrison on the frontiers or in the neighborhood of powers from whom they were in danger of encroachments or guards to take care of public arsenals would thereby be prohibited. The advocates for this power farther urge that it is necessary because it may and probably will happen that circumstances will render it requisite to raise an army to be prepared to repel attacks of an enemy before a formal declaration of war, which in modern times has fallen into disuse. If the Constitution prohibited the raising an army until a war actually commenced, it would deprive the government of the power of providing for the defense of the country until the enemy were within our territory. If the restriction is not to extend to the raising armies in cases of emergency, but only to the keeping them up, this would leave the matter to the discretion of the legislature, and they might, under the pretense that there was danger of an invasion, keep up the army as long as they judged proper, and hence it is inferred that the legislature should have authority to raise and keep up an army without any restriction. But from these premises nothing more will follow than this, that the legislature should not be so restrained as to put it out of their power to raise an army when such exigencies as are instanced shall arise. But it does not thence follow that the government should be empowered to raise and maintain standing armies at their discretion, as well in peace as in war. If indeed it is impossible to vest the general government with the power of raising troops to garrison the frontier posts, to guard arsenals, or to be prepared to repel an attack, when we saw a power preparing to make one, without giving them a general and indefinite authority to raise and keep up armies without any restriction or qualification, then this reasoning might have weight. But this has not been proved, nor can it be. It is admitted that to prohibit the general government from keeping up standing armies, while yet they were authorized to raise them in case of exigency, would be an insufficient guard against the danger. A discretion of such latitude would give room to elude the force of the provision. It is also admitted that an absolute prohibition against raising troops, except in cases of actual war, would be improper, because it will be requisite to raise and support a small number of troops to garrison the important frontier posts and to guard arsenals, and it may happen that the danger of an attack from a foreign power may be so imminent as to render it highly proper we should raise an army in order to be prepared to resist them. But to raise and keep up forces for such purposes and on such occasions is not included in the idea of keeping up standing armies in times of peace. It is a thing very practicable to give the government sufficient authority to provide for these cases, and at the same time to provide a reasonable and competent security against the evil of a standing army. A clause to the following purpose would answer the end. As standing armies in time of peace are dangerous to liberty, and have often been the means of overturning the best constitutions of government, no standing army or troops of any description whatsoever shall be raised or kept up by the legislature, except so many as shall be necessary for guards to the arsenals of the United States, or for garrisons to such posts on the frontiers as shall be deemed absolutely necessary to hold, to secure the inhabitants, and to facilitate the trade with the Indians, unless when the United States are threatened with an attack or invasion from some foreign power, in which case the legislature shall be authorized to raise an army to be prepared to repel the attack, provided that no troops whatsoever shall be raised in time of peace, without the assent of 2/3 of the members comprising both houses of the legislature. A clause similar to this would afford sufficient latitude to the legislature to raise troops in all cases that were really necessary, and at the same time competent security against the establishment of that dangerous engine of despotism, a standing army. The same writer who advances the arguments I have noticed makes a number of other observations with a view to prove that the power to raise and keep up armies ought to be discretionary in the general legislature. Some of them are curious. He instances the raising troops in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania to show the necessity of keeping a standing army in time of peace. The least reflection must convince every candid mind that both these cases are totally foreign to his purpose. Massachusetts raised a body of troops for 6 months, at the expiration of which they were to disband, of course. This looks very little like a standing army. But beside, was that commonwealth in a state of peace at the time? So far from it that they were in the most violent commotions and contents, and their legislature had formally declared that an unnatural rebellion existed within the state. The situation of Pennsylvania was similar. A number of armed men had levied war against the authority of the state and openly avowed their intention of withdrawing their allegiance from it. To what purposes examples are brought of states raising troops for short periods in times of war or insurrections on a question concerning the propriety of keeping up standing armies in times of peace, the public must judge. It is farther said that no danger can arise from this power being lodged in the hands of the general government, because the legislatures will be a check upon them to prevent their abusing it. This is offered, as what force there is in it will hereafter receive a more particular examination. At present I shall only remark that it is difficult to conceive how the state legislatures can, in any case, hold a check over the general legislature in a constitutional way. The latter has, in every instance to which their powers extend, complete control over the former. The state legislatures can in no case, by law, resolution, or otherwise, of right prevent or impede the general government from enacting any law or executing it which this Constitution authorizes them to enact or execute. If, then, the state legislatures check the general legislatures, it must be by exciting the people to resist constitutional laws. In this way, every individual or every body of men may check any government in proportion to the influence they may have over the body of the people. But such kinds of checks as these, though they sometimes correct the abuses of government, oftener destroy all government. It is further said that no danger is to be apprehended from the exercise of this power, because it is lodged in the hands of representatives of the people. If they abuse it, it is in the power of the people to remove them and choose others who will pursue their interests. Not to repeat what has been said before, that it is unwise in any people to authorize their rulers to do what, if done, would prove injurious. I have in some former numbers shown that the representation in the proposed government will be a mere shadow without the substance. I am so confident that I am well founded in this opinion that I am persuaded, if it was to be adopted or rejected, upon fair discussion of its merits, without taking into contemplation circumstances extraneous to it, as reasons for its adoption, 19/20 of the sensible men in the Union would reject it on this account alone, unless its powers were confined to much fewer objects than it embraces. Brutus. End Anti-Federalist Papers, Section 30, Brutus, Letter 10.